Painting fur in watercolour is something that I used to shy away from. I thought that watercolour wasn't the right medium to paint fur. Now I know differently. So this week I painted this little guy. Years ago, if I wanted to paint a furry animal, I'd steer away from painting it in watercolour. And I'd paint it in gouache or acrylic paint or something like that. I'd use a medium that I could layer the paint on with little brushes, and I'd try to capture all the detail that I thought I needed. Here's a squirrel painting that I painted about 7 years ago. This is a mixed media painting. I used watercolour, gouache, coloured pencil and probably some graphite, and I laboured over it for days. These days I don't have the patience for that, nor do I like to see all that detail anymore. Now I know that I can use watercolour on its own, and I can let the watercolour work for me. It doesn't have to be as labour intensive as this earlier painting was. I work mainly wet on wet now when I paint fur. I try to paint it in as few layers as possible so that I don't overwork it. And I use a big brush mainly. And I don't worry about painting all those little individual hairs. Before I painted this new squirrel, I did a graphite study, and that helped me work out where I wanted to put my hard and soft edges. Then I did a colour study, and that helped me work out colours and techniques, and I could see whether the painting was going to work or not. I often get asked about the paper that I use for my colour studies. People want to know if I paint my colour study on the same paper that I paint the main painting on, just to keep everything consistent. I do sometimes use the same paper. This one, for example, I did use the same paper. Both of them are on Arches cold pressed watercolour paper. But other studies that I do might be on different paper. Sometimes I'll use my watercolour journals. I've got Winsor & Newton journals, and I've got an Etcher journal. Sometimes I might use my Fabriano paper, and other times I might use my pad of Saunders Waterford paper. I don't really give it much thought, although one thing that I've realised lately is that I like to keep my paintings that I do for my tutorials. So if the colour study works out okay, I can sell it and make some money from it. So it's probably better for me if I do my colour studies on watercolour paper rather than in my journals. As I said, for this painting I used Arches cold pressed watercolour paper, and I stretched it before I painted on it. I started by painting a light wash of new gamboge over the top of the squirrel. Now I'm going to paint the tail in, so I'm wetting the area with water. I'm not only going to wet the tail where the tail sits, I'm going to wet the whole background. And that way the paint will wander gently into the background and give me those soft edges that I'm looking for. So I'm putting water over the entire right-hand side of the painting all the way to the edge. And then I start to use some new gamboge on the tail as well. I use my large round brush. This is a number 8 Da Vinci Maestro. And I'm not going to paint individual hairs like I used to. Instead, I'll give the entire tail a wash of this colour, and then while this colour's wet, I'll start to paint another colour over the top. So this colour here is burnt sienna. The new gamboge wash that I did is still wet, it hasn't dried, so this is going straight over the top of it. I'll leave some of that yellow showing through. I won't completely cover this with burnt sienna. So you can still see the yellow showing through. And that water on the paper is giving me all those soft edges. And I want soft edges here because I want the tail to look like it's further away than the body of the squirrel. Hard edges would only bring the tail forward. I ended up dropping some water onto the tail as it was drying to create a few watercolour blooms. But in the end, I did a bit more work over the top of it and I lost those blooms. So they really weren't necessary. Here I've wet the head of the squirrel and I'm painting some more new gamboge. Now I've got burnt sienna again. The paper's still wet. Those two colours blend together because of the water. Keeps all my paint edges soft. And I'm also using a big brush. I haven't switched down to a smaller brush yet. On the side of the face here, I want soft, lost edges. So I'm putting the water on the face, but I'm also taking it off onto the background as well. Okay, so that's nice and wet now. This is burnt sienna again. I run that down beside the eye. It goes up into the ear. And then I'll take it underneath the eye as well. And then I switch to new gamboge. It's a bit darker this time, so I've got more pigment on my brush. So I've got the two colours blending together there, and they're also bleeding off onto the background. I waited until that area was dry, and then I decided to work on the front section of the squirrel. Here again, I wanted soft paint edges. I want the colours that I use to gently blend into one another without creating any harsh lines. So when I wet the paper, I'm wetting a larger area than where I will be working. And that way the paint will remain within the edge of the water, and hopefully I won't get any hard edges forming where I don't want them. Here I'm using burnt sienna again. The paper's nice and wet. So I'll bring in the two sides of the squirrel, and then in the middle I'm going to mix a grey. I'll use French ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'll mix them together to make a cool grey. And I'll paint that on the centre part here. I'll take that colour up onto the head as well. And also on this side. That has dried, and up here, I don't know whether you can see it, but I've got a bit of a water line, which I don't want. So I can take this eradicator brush and gently rub at that to get rid of it. So the brush is wet, the paper's dry. So that's removed it. Up here on the outside edge of the ear, I want some hair, but instead of painting all the little hairs in individually, all I'm going to do is wet the paper and I'm going to run some paint down the edge, and that'll give me the fuzzy edge that I'm looking for. So that's wet, and now I've got some burnt sienna, and all I'm doing is running that down the edge of the ear, which makes it look like there's some hair down the side of the ear. Here I've got some Van Dyke brown that I'm putting over the top. It just darkens it slightly. I painted in the eyes and the nose and the little mouth, and I put a bit more colour around the snout. Now I want some fur down the side of the squirrel. I need the colour to be darker here, so I've just wet that area with water. And I've got burnt sienna again. Because I've taken the paint to the edge of my waterline under the head there, that gives me a hard edge. But everywhere else here, I've got the soft edge because I've got the water on the paper and my paint is staying within the boundaries of the water. Over here, I need to bring the shoulder closer than the tail. You can see at the moment they're the same colour value, so I need to darken this area. So that's a bit of water on there. And burnt sienna again here. So that helps to bring that shoulder forward in front of the tail. I do come back later and darken that further. Here I've wet the side of the head again and I'm painting some more burnt sienna. I wanted fuzzier edges, so I'm just increasing that and making that look a bit furrier. Painting on the wet paper. I think I'll wet down a bit further and I'll put a bit more down here. I'm still using my big brush and I'm not fussing too much with it. Just gives the illusion of a bit of fur. So then I wet over here again and I did a bit more work over here. I painted on the background and then I looked at this area and decided that it needed to be darker, so I wet it with water again, and this time I'm using Van Dyke Brown. Just put it where I want it and then I try to let it do its own thing pretty much. I try not to fuss with it. When I painted the whiskers on, I decided to paint them on damp paper as well, just to keep the edges of the whiskers a bit softer too, so they weren't too harsh. I used my number 2 Da Vinci Maestro brush and some of the grey that I mixed earlier for underneath the chin area. I did the same thing on this side. I wet the paper first and then I used that grey paint again. I knew I had to get the whiskers on fairly quickly without fussing with them, because if I laboured over them, I think it shows in the painting. Here I'm wetting the tail area. I decided to put a bit more colour on it. So I've got burnt sienna again. And I just wanted to extend a few little flicky bits out past the edge of the tail. I did those on wet paper as well because I didn't want any hard edges there. The paper's wet up here too. After I did that, I decided that I'd done enough. So I took the washi tape off and then I cut the paper from my board. And there it is finished. I'm going to make a full-length tutorial of this painting for my Patreon site. It'll be ready early next year sometime. I hope this video was helpful to you. Please give it a like and make sure you subscribe to my channel. And I will see you next week with a new tutorial.
It washed out. There's a top down touch.
I often get asked about the paper that I use. When you walk past, shakes.
I need a coffee.
do. Of course you do. Before I painted this new squirrel painting, I did a Before I painted the current people want to know if I paint my colour studies on the same paper that I paint the main painting on, just to keep everything. I often get asked about the paper that I use for my colour studies. People want to know if my paint my colour studies on watercolour paper rather than in my journals. As I said, for this painting, spitting at you, sorry.